For the latest and how this might play out in the U.S. and Iran, we turn to Joby Warrick of The Washington Post and Daniel Brumberg of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Joby, you wrote today that the U.S. officials originally were skeptical of this Iranian link. Today we see the president say the facts are there for all to see. What are they pointing to make the link?
It's interesting that they were skeptical at the beginning, because these are people who say normally we like to get excited about a case and then the skepticism comes in. In this case, they were skeptical from the beginning because it just didn't seem like something Iran would do. But as time went on, they had good evidence pointing to involvement by someone in the Iranian government. Specifically, they saw money being wired from Quds-controlled bank accounts, and they overheard conversations through wiretaps, and also participation of one of the suspects who became a cooperating witness, and were able to connect the plot very directly to some members of the Iranian government, at least at a medium level.
Now, there's also been people looking into Mr. Arbabsiar and his life in Texas, and some of it makes him sound like an unlikely plotter, or at least an unlikely person that the Quds Force would work with.
Yeah, this might be somebody for a good Pulp Fiction novel, but not for a real Iranian plot. Here's someone who was, he had been a used car salesman. He'd had a failed business making kebabs. He had a failed marriage. He'd lost his house just this past year. He was forgetful. He was bumbling. And so not the perfect specimen really for a hit like this. And yet this is the person that the U.S. alleges was the central U.S. player in trying to put this plot together.
And Gholam Shukuri, the other person here, whereabouts still unknown?
Yeah, he's much more interesting. He is a member of the Quds Force, and when Arbabsiar was arrested, they had him look at photographs to see if he could identify the people he talked to, and sure enough, Shukuri is a member of the Quds Force. There's no question about it. So he is someone who's directly involved in this case and someone who has ties to this very important elite military unit inside Iran.
Now, Dan Brumberg, in the meantime, the U.S. is trying to shore up support to get allies on board with them. We heard some support in our tape piece. Is there still also some puzzlement out there you're hearing?
Yes, I think so. I think if we recognize that among Iran experts, first of all, in the United States, whether on the left, center, or the right, there's a great deal of skepticism. It's a fantastic story, and it's hard in many respects to believe. So,
because why?
Well, because here you have to believe that the Iranian government, first and foremost, would engage in an act that would be an act of war with the United States, in effect. And this would be a kind of recklessness that you don't find even coming from the Iranian government and the Al-Quds forces. Apart from the fact that we're dealing with this used car salesman who apparently was a drunk and a womanizer and a drug user and the rest of it. The story has so many extraordinary aspects to it that the United States is going to have to work very hard to make its case. And also, of course, not simply to make the case, but to suggest what that case merits in terms of any kind of policy change from the United States.
Well, in terms of that, of course, we heard the president say there are going to be consequences. Now, what kind of measures are being considered?
You know, I don't have an inside track on that particular question, but my sense is, listening to the president in your piece just now and having read through the interviews with a great deal of other administration officials on and off the record, that they're being very careful about who, particularly within the Iranian government, they're going to blame and who they're going to hold accountable. And they're not suggesting that the blame go all the way up to the supreme leader. And it seems to me that in sort of trying to sort of maneuver through this thicket of ambiguity, this strange story, we're setting the grounds for a set of actions which will probably mean things such as enhanced sanctions, things short of the use of military force. That is my sense of this. So in that sense, this is going to be an evolution of U.S. foreign policy on Iran, but not a major break or a change in the direction of a military confrontation.
Well, we heard Joby, the State Department spokeswoman, say that there had been direct contact.
Yeah.
But we didn't hear any details. Do you know any more about what's going on behind the scenes?
This is very unusual because, as you know, we don't have diplomatic relations with the Iranians. There was direct contact. It's been very vaguely described, but there was a meeting today at the United Nations in New York involving U.S. and Iranian officials. What the content was, what they actually said to them, is you can kind of guess about, but we don't know in detail. But essentially, they are reaching out to the Iranians to complain about this and to say that there will be consequences. And on the flip side, the Iranians are saying, we've been attacked. We've had Iranian nuclear scientists killed, and we've been victims of terrorism. So there's a bit of a back and forth going on.
What is your sense of how much the administration, how hard they're working to convince others? Are they worried that they're not making their case at this point? Is there sort of a scramble, or is this just unfolding the way they expected.
It's interesting that they feel a bit handicapped by the strangeness of the story. So going around to people in New York, to other delegations, saying, this is what happened, it's so fantastic that they're a little bit worried that people will be skeptical and not believe it. But we've been talking to some of those delegations, Western Europeans and others, and they take this very seriously. They say the evidence is sound, and maybe this is a galvanizing moment when we can bring people together and maybe do something we couldn't do before.
Now, what about, Dan Brumberg, the isolating factor? This is further isolate Iran in the world. They're already isolated, right?
It does. It's isolated already, and it's going to make it more difficult for Iran to operate. It's going to provide further justification for more enhanced sanctions of different kinds. I think the real question will be whether the administration will use this plot as a basis for arguing for more punitive measures, including military measures. And I think that our allies, while wanting to support enhanced sanctions and other kinds of measures, really want to make sure that this is not used as a basis for even giving a green light to Israel for an attack on Iran and or the U.S. itself undertaking that sort of attack, which of course would open up a can of worms in the region. So the administration has to balance this very carefully, get consensus, get support. At the same time, they have to avoid signaling that this is simply going to open up a pathway for a new kind of hawkish approach to Iran.
And in the meantime, you hear from Iran denials, of course,
yes,
and throwing it back at the U.S. So this is a sign of U.S. weakness.
Well, you know, the Iranian political system is an opaque system. We know that. But if, in fact, this has been a rogue operation from some element within the Iranian special forces, Al-Quds forces, what have you, it would suggest a kind of breakdown in the decision-making process, which would be quite unprecedented, and suggest a falling apart of the Iranian system or a shift that could be very dangerous for Iran and for its neighbors and for the U.S. So if indeed this is a rogue operation, Iran's own leaders have cause for concern, and this may be one reason why they've been speaking with the U.S.
And briefly, Joby, the investigation is ongoing.
Yes, and there's the curious elements that are just intriguing to people, but I think the real meat of this is going to be what exactly Iran is attempting to do here. If it is behind this, it does smack to some people as desperation. They would try something like this. It might suggest division within the government. It might suggest eagerness to try to retaliate for things that are going over there, for sanctions, for the Stuxnet. So it's hard to say.
All right, Joby Warrick, Dan Brumberg, thanks very much.